Thank you, Flávio. Thank you, Flávio, for the introduction. I'm going now to present my PhD thesis. I would like first to thank you all the members who are going to evaluate my PhD presentation now. This work was advised by Flávio Silva and Daniel Cardoso. My name is Vitor Monteiro, and I'm going to present my research project, which was about the mechanical behavior and damage evolution of fiber reinforced concrete under fatigue loading and its application in, in wind towers. So, this research is part of a major cooperation project between PUC-Rio and Furnas, which aim to develop novel parameters for the application of FRC under extreme loading conditions. So this project was divided in two main branches, trying to understand the FRC behavior under impact loading, aiming its application for hydroelectric power plants, and the mechanical behavior under fatigue loading for wind towers endeavors, which is where my research project is part of. So there has been a major growth in the use of wind energy in Brazil. There has been in the last 10 years a major growth in the production of wind power along all our country. However, in the last 10 years, the wind power generation has been majorly concentrated in the northeast of our territory of around 86% of all wind energy in Brazil is concentrated at the moment. In order to reach and make those wind towers reach really high in the atmosphere and also to produce more and more wind energy, uh, bigger blades and our large turbines are becoming bigger and bigger. Therefore, due to many problems in terms of vibrations, due to the high average speed of the wind, steel structures have not been the best option for the construction of those wind towers. Therefore, in the last decades, the major solution for this type of endeavor has been the use of reinforced concrete or pre-stressed concrete or the combination of both. However, when we use reinforced concrete in those situations where there is a lot of cyclic loading, fatigue loading along all the useful life for those structures, there is a major concern when it comes to cracking evolution, mechanical deterioration along all those cyclic loadings along many years. Therefore, this research project aims to evaluate the use of fiber reinforced concrete and evaluate its mechanical behavior, aiming its use in this kind of application, and verify how fibers can mitigate the mechanical deterioration along all the useful life of those kind of structures. Therefore, my research project was divided into five major sections. So the research goes from the interface level, evaluating the interface degradation in the fiber level, goes to the mechanical characterization in the material level, and goes in the end to verify the structural behavior in the fatigue loading with the additional fibers. Along our research, we also propose some novel models for FRC fatigue and also evaluate the bond slip behavior with also the use of some novel analytical equations. So for my first section, we'll bring the main results for the flexural fatigue loading of FRC in the material level. So our experimental program used is based on a self-consolidating concrete, which reached a mean value of 50 MPa after 28 days. So this composition was used along our research project. The composition presents two types of sand, the use of silica, fly ash, superplasticizers, viscosity modifiers in order to reach the flowability needs for the composition. He also used a water cement factor of 0.50. The used steel fibers were hooked end steel fibers with 45 of aspect ratio and 30 millimeters of length. Three fiber mass fractions were added to the mix, 20, 40, and 60 kilos per cubic meter. So the experimental program to evaluate the mechanical degradation in the material level consisted on pre-cracking the beans, pre-notched beans, until reaching the CMOD of 0.50 millimeters, the crack opening. The bean was unloaded, and then the fatigue test began. The fatigue test consisted of oscillating the loads between the upper loads and the lower loads, while the upper load was a fraction, a percentage of the flexural residual strength from 70%, 80%, or 90% of the recorded load from the pre-crack at 0.50 millimeters of CMOD. So along the fatigue test, the CMOD was monitored, recorded by the clip gauge, and the fatigue tests were carried on until reaching 1 million cycles or the being rupture. So one of the first results we have for the beans under fatigue was the evolution of the CMOD. So it's possible to verify for all load levels an almost linear increase in CMOD until reaching around 0.50 millimeters of CMOD. Then there is a sharp increase in the CMOD increase rate until the bean reaches its fracture. Based on these first results, we could also develop the SN curve, which brings us a mean evaluation of the fatigue life of the material for the studied load levels. And then we can have a curve, a line that brings us these mean values of fatigue life. However, more recent studies in fatigue life are already developing new methodologies to evaluate the fatigue life based on probabilistic methods. So for this research, I applied the Weibull distributions to study the fatigue life. So using the two parameter and three parameter Weibull distributions, we have built, developed curves that are based on failure probability based on these probabilistic methods. So we can have the fatigue life based on a failure probability. For a two-parameter Weibull distribution, we can reach a line of based on a failure probability. And for the three-parameter, we can have a nonlinear curve with an asymptotic behavior reaching the 0.50 load level for this distribution. The next step was evaluating the material degradation along the fatigue life. So we evaluated the material degradation in terms of stiffness and dissipated energy along the cycles. The stiffness was calculated as a slope of each of the cycles recorded, and the energy dissipated as the area inside each hysteresis loop. So here we have the first graphs of stiffness decaying along the fatigue life. So it's possible to verify an almost linear decay of the stiffness after the first cycles until reaching the rupture. It's possible to verify that the stiffness is directly correlated with the residual strength, since the more fiber fractions on the material, higher stiffness are recorded. So this makes sense because the more number of fibers in the cracked section, we have a higher flexural residual strength, which promotes higher stiffness of the cracked material. With the stiffness decay, we can also propose some empirical equations to verify the damage in terms of stiffness along the fatigue life. Similar approach was done for the energy release. One more time, we have this correlation with flexural residual strength with energy dissipated. So we have more energy dissipated along the fatigue life when we have more fibers in the composition in the cracked section. And one more time, we also make some empirical equations to verify this energy release along the fatigue life. So some of the main conclusions of this first section was that the Weibull distributions make a good fit, a good methodology to evaluate the fatigue life of FRC using the probability methods, the probabilistic methods to verify the fatigue life with a more powerful methodology than using only the traditional mean fatigue life analysis. It was possible to propose and verify the stiffness decay along the fatigue life and verify the influence of the amount of fibers in the stiffness along the cycles. And finally, we also propose some empirical equations to verify this degradation. The next session, we have the degradation now in the interface level, the fiber interface level, and see how the fatigue is going to make the degradation in the interface between fiber and matrix. So the experimental program, we have a pull-out test using those dog bone shaped specimens. They are good since we can make a aluminum claw that can have a very good grip on these specimens. The fiber is positioned in the center of the specimen, and the tests were controlled. The fatigue tests were controlled with the external load cell of 5 kilonewtons. So the the fatigue test has a similar methodology from the similar to what we have already seen in the material level. We had first a pre-sleep of the pull-out test until reaching around the bone strength, the maximum bone strength, and then the specimen was unloaded, and then the fatigue test began, oscillating between the upper loads, the lower loads, until reaching or a million cycles or the failure in the interface. All the tests were carried on at 6 Hz of oscillation frequency. So one of the main results in the interface degradation is that we could observe two major types of failure in this pull-out fatigue test. We could observe a pull-out failure or the fiber rupture failure. What that exactly means that during the test, when we have a pull-out failure, we couldn't reach many cycles before failure. We could reach a maximum number of 1,000 cycles before the pull-out failure for both hooked ends and straight fibers. The pull-out failure is simply that the fiber is pulled from the matrix. For the fiber rupture, we need more cycles for it to happen, and is majorly controlled by the fracture or the degradation of the steel wire inside the matrix. So one is controlled by the interface degradation inside the matrix, and the second one is controlled by the degradation of the steel wire, which also degrades during the fatigue. The steel material degrades along the test. So here we have to see how the pull-out failure happened. It was possible to verify a significant evolution of the sleep. For the pull-out failure, we can here see at the blue curve, it has a sleep evolution for the pull-out failure. And for this kind of failure, we could verify that the hook of the fiber presents a straightening after the pull-out. So during the degradation of the interface, this hook is being straightening along the fatigue life until it is completely pulled from the dog bone specimen. For the next failure type, we could verify the degradation of the steel wire. That means that the steel ruptures inside the dog bone specimen. It's possible to verify through the CT scan image here that part of the hook is still inside the dog bone specimen after the fiber has been pulled, has been fractured around the hook of the hooked end steel fiber. For this kind of failure, it's not possible to verify any significant sleep evolution along the test. We can here see at the red curve that there is almost no sleep until the fiber reaches the fracture, and then the fiber is pulled from the matrix. So one of the major conclusions that we can take from this test, fatigue test in the interface level, is that we have two major distinct failure modes. We have the fiber failure and the fiber pullout when we are having this interface fatigue test. And there is a clear division in terms of number of cycles for each failure mode. For pullout failure, we have a small number of cycles. For the where the steel wire failure will have a higher number of cycles since it's being controlled by the fatigue and degradation of the steel material. When fiber is pulled out from the fatigue loading, the hook is progressively straightening along the fatigue life. In the case of the fiber rupture, the steel wire presents its fracture, and then the pull out the fiber is pulled from the matrix. Now we go to the next section, which brings the bond sleep behavior under fatigue loading. And I will also present the development of some analytical equations for the analysis of the bond slip behavior of rebars in FRC matrix. So first, the experimental program. We have rebar pull-out tests. We carry on quasi-static pull-out tests from the rebar in the FRC matrix. So we wanted to evaluate the rebar concrete interface characterization. So we used a rebar of 6.3 millimeters, 60 millimeters of bond length, which is around 10 times the rebar diameter. After we have the experimental program, we also applied some analytical models to verify the bond slip behavior in the quasi-static mode. Then we have the fatigue pull-out tests. For the fatigue pull-out test, we have a similar approach. The test oscillated between the upper level, upper loads, and the lower loads. The upper load is a fraction of the maximum bond strength recorded from the quasi-static tests. So we could have load levels of 50, 80, and 90% of this bond strength, and it was oscillating between this range of loads until reaching a million cycles or the the failure of the specimen. So before presenting the results, I would like to try to explain a summary, an overview of the analytical models that were applied for the quasi-static tests. So the analytical models try to evaluate the bond slip behavior through three distinct stages. So the first stage that the bond slip model is evaluating is the elastic stage, where there is a perfect bond between the rebar and the concrete. Then there is the non-linear stage, where there is a unbonding length going on until the complete bond length is unbonded from the concrete. And then stage three is characterized by the dynamic motion of the rebar. That means a rigid body motion of the rebar coming out of the concrete matrix. So in order to make this model work, we need to define the shear stresses along the bond length. So we have the maximum elastic strength, which is presenting here after an linear linear evolution of the strength. Then we have the frictional strength, which is associated with the unbonding of the rebar from the concrete matrix. And after the complete embedment length is unbonded from the concrete, we begin to have the dynamic stage in which the rebar is pulling out from the matrix with an almost constant shear dynamic stress and coming out with this value of delta D, which is the amount of rebar that has already been pulled out from the specimen, the concrete matrix. So after we apply those shear stresses on for different slip values, we can calculate the bond force in the interface and then obtain the load slip curve, which is presented here in this figure. So we applied the model for different results in the literature and also from the experimental results carry on in this research. We could observe a very good fit. So the use of the proposed three stages for the pullout presented very good fit with the experimental results. Uh, the analytical model was applied changing for the literature results. Distinct parameters were changing, like the rebar diameter, the fiber fraction, the bonded length of the rebar, the compressive stress. So changing those parameters, we applied the analytical model and they have presented a very good fit for changing those four major parameters in our model. So based on the results from the literature and from this experimental campaign, we could also make an empirical equation to evaluate the maximum bond strength for the rebar in the FRC matrix and try to correlate empirically the maximum bond strength based on those material and geometrical parameters. Some of the major limitations of this analytical model is related to the concrete cover, since we could not use, know that based on the literature that the concrete cover on the rebar increases the confinement and enhances the bond strength, but the model is a 2D model and it cannot use this third dimension of the cover and its influence in the bond strength. So we cannot include this parameter, important parameter, on the model. A second limitation is based on the type of failure. If we this model is assuming that we have an interface degradation. That means only a small ring of concrete is mobilized during the pull-out. So we have an almost perfect pull-out of the rebar with the presence of really small cracks on the top surface when the rebar is being pulled out from the matrix. So this is also a limitation because sometimes we can verify uh, very large cracks in this kind of test. But this model could not be applied because it's not assuming that a very large area of concrete is being mobilized during the pullout. Another limitation is that the additional fiber is not influencing the stiffness, the pullout stiffness along the test, because it is majorly controlled by the concrete area, and we could not have the influence of the fibers in this initial stiffness. The next step is to bring the degradation of the pullout, the bond slip along the fatigue test. So the major way we verified to study the degradation of the pullout is through the slip evolution along the fatigue test. So for in order to verify the slip evolution, we proposed an empirical equation, which has already been used. A similar equation had already been used in the literature before by Ram et al. And other authors. So they usually used based on a power law. And for this research, we propose this power law, which is based on the initial slip, based on delta zero, and the index number of cycles, which ranges from 0 to 1, where 1 is the when there is the rupture of the pullout from the specimen. This model is largely dependent on the initial slip, which can be calculated based on the quasi-static results. So for my experimental campaign, we could verify good fitting with a linear equation for the initial slip, delta zero. But for Rain and all, we needed to do a different equation. So for each type of parameters that we use in the experimental campaign, we will need uh, to calibrate the initial sleep depending on the factors, the rebar diameter, and so on. So it needs to be calibrated in terms of the quasi-static tests that can be evaluated before the fatigue analysis. So we presented good fitting for the different applied load levels. So here we have the results for the outer ring at all for the different. So we could verify a good fitting and a good evolution of the sleep for all studied load levels from his experimental research. So one of the major conclusions that we could evaluate in this section that the analytical model for the bond slip presented a good fit for the experimental parameters that we studied, such as fiber factor, bondment length, compressive strength, and so on. So it presented good results. The analytical model could make a good fit, a good way to evaluate the quasi-static behavior. It has some limitations that I have already being discussed along the presentation. And we also could evaluate the sleep evolution, which characterizes the, the degradation of the interface between rebar and concrete under fatigue. So we have could evaluate it in terms of empirical analytical equations, the bond sleep behavior, and also the pull out under fatigue loading based on those mathematical equations. So the next step is bring an overview of the closed form solutions models for the FRC fatigue that we could also analyze along this PhD research. So the first step to analyze the closed form solution is to analyze the analytical equations in terms of the quasi-static behavior. This is the first step. So the models need to have a good application of the constitutive relations. So for compression of the FRC, we use an elastic plastic behavior. And for detention, we use a quad linear model, which have four lines representing the pre-peak and the post-peak behavior of the FRC intention. It's possible to verify that the post-peak is majorly analyzed in terms of adimensional parameters, which are all calculated as a function of the cracking, strain, and stress. So the post-crack stresses are calculated as a function of the cracking stress. The same thing is done for the strains. After the constitutive relations are carefully analyzed, we can go to the stress strain distributions and calculate the stresses along the crack section of the FRC. So we assume linear strains, kick-off hypothesis, and assuming that there is the flexural rupture of the beam is controlling the main mechanical behavior of the FRC in the material level. However, there is still a major parameter that we need to carefully analyze in this model, which is the CMOD. This is very important because, as we see in the beginning of the presentation, is that the CMOD is monitored by the clip gauge along the fatigue test. So it is a key parameter. We need to know how the CMOD evolves along the fatigue test. So how we can go from the stress strain domain and go to the stress CMOD domain. This is a key correlation that we need to do to evaluate the CMOD in this kind of test. So we use the characteristic length, which has already been studied by Plizzari and Professor Mobesher and other authors in the literature. So the characteristic length is calculates the cracking strain based on these adimensional parameters and use the characteristic length to transform it in the CMOD. So from with using the characteristic length, we can go from the stress strain domain to the stress CMOD stress factor domain. So here is the model workflow. So the first steps we have already been analyzed and discussed. We have the constitutive relations for FRC. Then we make the closed form solutions to analyze the quasi-static behavior of the material in terms of the stress strain and the applied constitutive relations. Then for fatigue, what we need to analyze the fatigue degradation, we need first as input an ascent curve, which will bring for us a number of cycles before failure. So the ascent curve can bring a mean number of cycles before failure to analyze the fatigue degradation. Then we need to verify how CMOD evolves along the fatigue useful life of the material. So we need to have an equation, an empirical equation. We can correlate the CMOD as a function of number of cycles and now as a function of the applied load level of the test or the structure. After we know how the CMOD evolves, we can parameterize how the CMOD values change along the fatigue life and use the closed form solutions to calculate the other mechanical parameters that are being calculated with the closed form solution. So the CMOD evolves along the fatigue and the closed form solutions are used to calculate the other mechanical parameters that we need. So such as the tensile strain, such as the flexural residual strain, and how they evolve along the fatigue test or the fatigue useful life of the material. So now I'm going to bring the application of this model workflow for some results in the literature. So we have the tensile strength for the results from Monteiro, Carles, and Stefan. We applied the constitutive models on the tension and compression. So we have here the plastic elastic compression model, and the quad linear model intention for the studied authors. After that, we can verify if, after using the constitutive models, if they have good fitting with the experimental results in terms of load CMOD for the studied author. So we have here for the three studied authors a good fitting of the analytical equations for Cardoso, Stephan, and Monteiro. We could verify a good fitting with the experimental results, and so the closed form solutions are done for the quasi-static behavior. The next step is verify using as input for the model the SN curve. So we have the SN curves for the authors. And the next step is to evaluate how CMOD evolves along the fatigue life. So here we propose an empirical equation, which is here, and uses the initial CMOD, the, the cycle index, and an exponent that is based on the load level, and also make a fit on the experimental results we have from the lab. So after we have the SN curve, the CMOD evolution, and the closed form solutions, we can study now how the other mechanical parameters evolve under fatigue loading. So we can verify the evolution of the crack length, which is a fracture parameter, how the crack length is evolving in fatigue, how the tensile strands are evolving under fatigue, the residual flexural stress, and any other parameter that we want that is calculated through the closed form solution. So after this parameterization, we can go from CMOD evolution and calculate the rest of the parameters. So as a conclusions for this section, we have that the quad linear constitutive model was a good fit for the quasi-static results. So the quad linear tension constitutive model was successfully used in this analysis. The proposed empirical equation for CMOD also presented correctly fit for the CMOD under fatigue, and the closed form solutions were used to estimate the other mechanical parameters evolution along the fatigue. The major limitation of the model is still the crack evolution, that since we used an empirical equation, it needs to be calibrated for any kind of material that we are studying, since it is empirically studied based on past results. Therefore, one major limitation is based on this degradation of the CMOD, and probably the major step that could be done after this research is developing a more adequate and more robust based on fracture mechanics to evaluate how the crack and the CMOD evolves with the fatigue loading. And finally, the last section, I'm going to bring some results for the structural level and verify how the structure with the use of fibers, a reinforced concrete structure with the use of fibers, degrade, mitigate along the fatigue loading. So the experimental campaign was based on a reinforced concrete beam, which was designed to present its rupture in flexure. We attached many concrete strain gauges along the face on the top, also to verify how the compression strains evolve along the fatigue test, and also gauges on the rebars to verify also how the rebar strains are evolving under the cyclic loads. We also put some LVDTs to verify deflection along the test and how the tests were carried on. We made first a pre-crack on the beam until reaching 50% and 80% of the rebar yielding strain. So the rebar yielding was measured with the strain gauges until reaching the values of 1,900 and 1,200 microstrain. The test was stopped by being unloaded, and then the force recorded at those strains were saved and used for the fatigue test. So the upper load was the recorded load at reaching those percentages of the rebar yielding strain. The tests were carried on until a million cycles or the beam rupture. We also did the digital image correlation analysis to verify how cracks were oscillating along the tests, the structural fatigue tests. The the high speed cameras could capture 5,000 frames for each trigger since the beam is oscillating at a very high frequency, 6 hertz. So we could only evaluate how the cracks are oscillating with high speed cameras. So we used 1,000 hertz capture frequency in this test. And the system was triggered after 5 minutes, 24 hours, and 36 hours after the beginning of the fatigue test. So we have some of the first results. We can analyze in the first graph how the steel rebar strains are evolving for concrete without the use of fibers. And in the next graph, we have the concrete, reinforced concrete without fibers. It's possible to verify a major evolution in the rebar strains, especially without the addition of fibers. It's possible to know that both beams were subjected to the same loading range from 4.5 and 15 kilonewtons approximately. So without the use of fibers, the beam reached rupture and presented a major evolution in the rebar strain under fatigue. The addition of fibers are responsible for redistributing the stresses around the tension zone and not and mitigating the rebar strain evolution along the fatigue. So the fibers were successfully applied in order to mitigate the degradation of the rebars and not being making that they're being reached rupture, even that they were at the same load level in comparison with the reinforced concrete without the use of fibers. So here we have the summary of the results of the rebar evolution, strain evolution. So we can see that a major rebar strain evolution takes place when we have no fibers added in the mix until the beam reaches its rupture. And the same phenomena can be analyzed for deflection, since the use of fibers can enhance the stiffness of the reinforced concrete structure and diminish the deflections of the overall structure along the fatigue line. Now we have the stiffness decay. Once again, with the use of fibers, we have a higher values of stiffness along the fatigue test. And here we have a small video showing the oscillation of the major observed crack on the both beams with and without fibers. So we can see how the crack is oscillating along one of the cycles, one of the triggers we did in the lab. So it's oscillating between 0.30 and 0.15 around millimeters. So we could evaluate that with the digital image correlation system in the high speed cameras. So here we have the cracks evolving along the test. Once again, the redistribution of stresses with the fibers are diminishing the crack width along the fatigue test. So the fibers were successfully done in terms of mitigating the crack propagation evolution on the structural beams. So one of the main conclusions that we can have in this last section is that the rebar strains revolution were controlled when we control the overall fatigue behavior of the beam. So when we have more rebar strain evolving in the structural tests, is a possible way to evaluate how the structure is degrading along the cyclic loads. The additional fibers could significantly influence the rebar strain evolution in mitigating the deterioration of the structure by redistributing the stresses in the tension zone. Similar mechanical deterioration was observed, mitigating the deterioration with the use of fibers, so it could mitigate the major mechanical parameters of the concrete beam with the use of fibers in the fatigue loading. So some final comments to finish my presentation. So we could evaluate the FRC degradation in different levels. We went from the fiber well to the material structural levels to evaluate the degradation of the FRC in major aspects. We could also propose some novel methodologies and equations, analytical equations, empirical equations to study the mechanical degradation of FRC, and they were all in general successfully done and fitted with the experimental data. We still need more information on crack growth of FRC in terms of studying more refined equations of fracture that can bring more information on how crack evolves along the fatigue is a key aspect to evaluate the degradation that is still missing in this research project and can be done in future studies. Also, novel models can be proposed for the mechanical degradation, especially in the structural level. We could propose many equations and results in the material level. Now we need to go to the structural level and also try to propose new equations in that structural level. And this PhD thesis is just the kickstart of a series of other works that are going to come in the next years by our other colleagues here in the lab, which are also studying fatigue of FRC. So I would like to thank the sponsors, the CNPq, CAPES, and all the funding that was done along the research. This work was also done in cooperation with Furnas and also with Arizona State University. Thank you all, and I'm happy to answer any questions.